Mr. Harper, thanks for giving us this interview. Can we start with a brief history, of your credentials, your career?
Yes, of course. I joined the Metropolitan Police in 1974 after 3 years in the military police. And in the Metropolitan Police, I served in Brixton and did my probationary period in Brixton, then did a year in the robbery squad at Brixton as a trainee detective. I served in other areas of South London, specialising eventually in child abuse and street robberies and an awful lot of sexual offences such as rape and indecent assault. In 1979 and 80, I spent time in West Belfast working with the Royal Ulster Constabulary and worked not only in West Belfast investigating terrorist crimes such as murders and hijackings and shootings, but also at the interrogation centres where I was engaged in interrogating terrorists of all colours. On returning to the Metropolitan Police, I was engaged in for a short period in uniform, during which time I worked at Tottenham in the Broadwater Farm riots and in the Wapping disorders before returning back to CID again, and spent about 5 years as a detective inspector at Peckham, where again I was dealing with on average about a rape every 2 or 3 days, and I think during my last year at Peckham I dealt with something like 9 murders. So wide experience there. I joined Strathclyde Police in 1991 and served in the East End and the West End of Glasgow before moving to Jersey in 2002.
Okay, shall we go on to, I don't like to mention this, but it's our local media again. I don't want to dwell on it. The local media can't seem to mention your name without mentioning the infamous coconuts. Please put the record straight. As you see it, we have seen scientific evidence which tells us this item contained 1.6% collagen, and despite deputies Wimberley, Hill, Pittman, myself and others asking questions how a piece of child's skull turns into coconut containing 1.6% collagen, we've still not seen any evidence. In your professional opinion, evidence-based, is it coconut or is it skull?
Well, the truth of the matter is that I don't know for 100% exactly what it is. What I do know and what the facts are as follows. This item was found by an anthropologist who is a very well-respected anthropologist who has worked all over the world in recovering human remains, and that anthropologist identified that item as a piece of a child's skull. She even told us where it came from on the morning she found it. It was kept in our store for a few days, and it was eventually sent off to the laboratory in Oxford. Now, even that in itself disproves some of the stupid lies and misapprehensions have been put about, notably by some of the Jersey media, but also by 1 or 2 journalists in the UK as well, because they were saying that I was told that this was not a human skull the day after we found it. Well, the item was still sitting in our store the day after we found it, and it eventually went off to the laboratory in Oxford, who came back and said, first of all, it's very badly degraded, and we don't think we'll be able to find any collagen in it, and they kept referring to it at this stage as a skull and as a piece of bone. In fact, I think they referred to it as the Jersey skull. They then came back and says, look, we were wrong about this. We've actually found 1.6 collagen, which is quite a bit above the quantity of collagen that we need to date this thing. So we're quite comfortable that we will be able to date it now. We'll find out when this skull went in the ground and when it died. And then a few days later, they came back again and says, look, we can't date it because the collagen is very, very badly degraded, which means either that it might not be skull, or B, that the skull is so badly degraded that it's just impossible to date it. And that was the situation then, as it was. And as far as I'm aware, I've never ever been told anything that has advanced it from that. That it was either a possibility that it wasn't skull, or there was a possibility that it was skull which was so badly degraded that it wouldn't be able to be dated. Now, the coconut nonsense came from a throwaway comment where this piece of evidence, which had been meticulously audited and tracked on our systems, was then passed about by these people in the laboratory to others whose names we were never given, which would have rendered it totally useless in evidence in any event, who said, oh, it looks like a piece of coconut. But there was never any scientific substance to that. There was never any definitive information as to just what it was at that stage. And when it came back, of course, our anthropologist was quoted as saying she had changed her mind and it was no longer her opinion that it was human skull. But of course I disproved this by showing her log, where she wrote on her log when the item came back that she was now not so sure because the item had changed in size, texture and appearance. Now that opened up all sorts of questions, and if we tried to use that in evidence, the defence would have run a bus through us by saying that we couldn't prove it was the same item that went away. And of course we couldn't, because it had been handed about while it was away. So my definitive answer is that I have no definitive information on that. As I say, it could well be human skull, but it may not be, and I suspect we will never know properly.
So I suppose at best we can say it's inconclusive. Nobody can say one way or the other what this item is.
Absolutely. We put it across this laboratory for, and I have to emphasise, they got the evidence to carbon date it, not to tell us what it was. They're not qualified to tell us what it was. The anthropologist who found the item was very qualified to say what it was, and she thought at the time that it was a piece of human skull, and she identified the part of the skull that she believed it came from. Now, when it came back, she said that she could no longer be so certain, but that's a world of difference from what the media in Jersey were quoting as saying that she had changed her mind, and what I believe that Gradwell and Mr. Workup were also saying. They quoted her saying she had changed her mind, and that was totally untrue.
Yeah, okay. So when our mainstream media are saying it's coconut, in your opinion, that isn't based on scientific evidence? It's not
based on a statement of fact that I have ever seen or have ever received, or indeed, it's contrary to everything that we were told. There was no definitive conclusion, and it flies in the face of the fact that the laboratory said that they found collagen, which of course is not found in coconut. Collagen is only found in mammals, including humans.
Thanks for wrapping that up and putting the record straight. Now, we're going to have a committee of inquiry into the whole child abuse atrocities investigation, possible cover-up. What or who do you believe ought to be included in its terms of reference?
The most important thing in the terms of reference has got to be looking at how the abuse happened, because I don't think that the government in Jersey have ever really accepted that this abuse took place. They give throwaway comments and backhandedly say, yes, we're sure that some misbehaviour and some abuse went on, but they have consistently downplayed the seriousness of the abuse that went on. They've consistently thrown insults and tried to discredit the victims, and they have just never really ever admitted that there was a chronic, systematic and known about period where the most horrific child abuse went on, and they have downplayed this since day one. So that needs to be at the very forefront of any committee of inquiry as to how this abuse happened, how it was allowed to happen, and how the authorities failed to bring it to justice. And I think that's got to include not only the caring agencies in Jersey, it's also got to include the States of Jersey Police at that time. Certainly it's got to include the Law Officers Department and from the Attorney General down. And then it's also going to look at some politicians as well, the part they played. And I think that's very, very important. And it's got to include, those are the main things that it's got to include: how this abuse happened, the extent of the abuse, because I don't think that we even, even with the strides forward that we made in getting people to come forward, I don't think that we uncovered the full extent of it. And I think that there's a lot more to come out yet, including the culpability of those in charge of the children's homes of Jersey at the times concerned.
Well, there could be possibly a sticking point because, to your knowledge, are there people still employed by our government in positions of power or authority that were suspects in the child abuse investigation that were never charged? If so, how many do you believe are still employed by our government?
I could think of at least 4 in fairly senior positions here are still there. I may be a little bit out of date on that, but there's certainly 4, the last I heard, which was about 15 months ago, and certainly 2 or 3 of those are still employed in very senior positions who were suspects in the inquiry, priority suspects, I have to say, in the inquiry, also, in my view, against whom there was evidence to have charged them, and if they'd been in the United Kingdom, they would have been charged. I have no doubt about that.
Again, we need to put the record straight because history's getting rewritten by our media and the rest of it. There's a very distorted view of the history going on. Just for the record, did you or have you ever said there were murders at Hotel Garin?
No, and you don't have to look very far to see that. You don't have to look for any further than for instance, the BBC News website, I think from the 1st of July 2008, where I quite clearly, and it's still available on the internet, where I quite clearly said that unless the evidence changed, there would be no homicide inquiry because the evidence was of such a contradictory nature that we could not prove that homicide, murders, or manslaughters had taken place at Hotel Garin. That's not the same as saying that no horrible crimes ever took place there. There were crimes committed there. There were crimes committed there against children. And at the very least, parts of children's bodies were buried there illegally. Why is another question. But I have clearly been on the record so many times saying that there's no evidence of homicide. There's a difference between saying that we have to treat the scene as a homicide scene, a potential homicide, and then going on to say that there have been murders at Hotel Garin. The former attitude, where we had to treat it as a homicide scene, was endorsed by ACPO and by others as well. And the funny thing is that Wiltshire police, the infamous Wiltshire inquiry, who interviewed me for 5 days solid over 2 periods and tape recorded every single word that I said, were told of all of this, and indeed. They, I think Graham Power alludes to it in his, somewhere in his, either his affidavit or some other document that he produced. He has documentation which showed that Wiltshire Constabulary employed a number of officers to search through every single bit of my media interaction in the hope of finding somewhere where I had said that there had been murders committed at Hotel Garin. And in the end, the officers could only report back that in actual fact, the only thing I said was that we had no evidence that there were any murders at Hotel Garin. But that seems to have been lost in the wash, and seems to have been lost in particular by the Jersey Evening Post and by Ian Lamarcombe.
Yes, so a lot of stuff's getting lost. HMIC reports, the year 2000 HMIC report, where that basically said yourself and Graham Power had, shall we say, turned around a failing police force. That HMIC report has gone out the window.
Yes, I mean, the HMI report before Graham took up his post was absolutely damning. It was very, very critical, one of the most critical I've seen of a police service. And the first one that we received told of the huge progress that the force had made under Graham's leadership. And then when they came back 2 years later, that program of progression had been built upon. And indeed, they were fulsome in their praise for the modernisation that had been carried out of the force. And among the areas that they were particularly pleased with were in the areas of integrity and professional standards. And of course, that was something that I think it was Dick Shenton who had particularly criticised myself for what he said was a waste of money in trying to bring corrupt cops to book. But the HMI were particularly pleased with that. Also, the progression we had made in the area of inappropriate behaviour and in respect of minorities and female officers. And Graham Power introduced all those changes, and indeed, as you say, the HMI reports, which were absolutely first class, seem to have been deliberately forgotten about in all that has happened since.
Well, that brings us on to the ACPO reports, the Association of Chief Police Officers report, who are mentoring you. Now, our Home Affairs Minister, Senator Ian Lamarca, told us on live radio that he was going to give us a scandal concerning the ACPO team who are mentoring your investigation. The scandal had the context that your mentor, I don't want to name him, but he's a very respected, renowned investigator, was giving you favourable reports so he could get a job in the States of Jersey Police. I mean, is that credible? Is it credible?
Well, for a start, let me just say that anybody who thinks that by giving me favourable reports would earn him favour with Bill Ogley, Neil Harper and anybody else in Jersey would need to be offered marbles. The fact remains that, as you say, this man is one of the world's most renowned homicide detectives, and he is not in the business of giving anybody favourable reports for the fun of it. That comment reminded me a bit on, I don't know if you're old enough to remember Mr. Magoo, who used to come out into the sunlight and was blinking. But Mr. Lamarcon talks about scandal, and the scandal was apparently that this man was at that time thinking of applying, and eventually did apply for the job of Deputy Chief Officer in the States of Jersey Police. And that is some scandal when you look at what Mr. Lamarcon has been surrounded in the last 15 months in respect of the terrible suspension and the absolutely farcical suspension of Graham Power. Perhaps that's more fitting for the word scandal than the nonsense that he tried to come out with, because he did try to make it seem as if the scandal was something really to do with integrity and something absolutely disastrous, which would forever condemn this man to be associated with corruption, when all it was a load of nonsense. There were three very respected members of that ACPO homicide review team who were appointed by very senior officers in the United Kingdom, and they went through our inquiry with a fine-tooth comb. And they weren't the first ones. I mean, you've got to go back to the actual operation at Haute de la Garonne, where we were bit by bit digging up areas after we had evidence to go further. The homicide search advisors from the National Policing Improvement Agency said that was a top example of good practice, the way that was carried out. And as I remember, Mr. Workup and Mr. Gradwell, in a blaze of publicity, said that they would never ever have made the decision to go in to Haute de la Garonne and excavate the way we did. And the only thing I say is shame on them, because it was there to be done. And I think that even I caught somewhere in the Wiltshire report, which was hidden away and certainly never mentioned by Ian Lamarcon, where Wiltshire said that they had no argument with our decision to go in and excavate. So the whole thing regarding ACPO, who were on our shoulders all the time and giving us advice and looking at what we were doing, and were very, very positive. Yeah, they did find things that they said, look, maybe you ought to be doing this. And a lot of those things that we did, one or two of the things I turned around and said, look, I don't think this is suitable, and we had a discussion about it. And one of those, of course, was the infamous Gold Group, where, in the UK they appoint a Gold Group of various different organisations. Well, if we had done that, I think Graham Power's already made this point, if I had appointed a Gold Group, I would have been putting some of the worst suspects for this abuse onto our Gold Group and giving them access to all our intelligence and information coming in. Something which, of course, the Attorney General tried to foist on us with the so-called independent lawyer at a later stage.
Well, it's good that you mentioned the Mick Gradwell and David Walkup, because they held a press conference that basically trashed your investigation while the investigation was still live. They also exhibited potential items of evidence on the, to the Sky News. Have you witnessed anything like this before in modern day policing? No, I have to say I haven't. And of course it was changed at the last moment, wasn't it?
And where the pressure to change that came from, I can only guess. But that's not the original press conference that they were going to do. Graham Power was told that. I was also told that by a reporter from BBC Panorama who spoke to Gradwell. And, this reporter from Panorama was told that the press conference was simply going to say that they had no evidence of murder, which is what I was saying all along. And then all of a sudden, it changed, and they came out with a load of nonsense that they did. But of course, that press conference now has been discredited so clearly and so easily by not only by people like yourselves who have torn it apart, but of course by Bob Hill. I mean, for instance, they said there were no sellers, so not only did they say that I wasn't telling the truth, but worst of all, they were clearly coming out and saying, victims of abuse, you're lying through your teeth. Those of you who say you were abused, you're telling lies because there are no cellars. There's only a couple of floor voids, which are so small you couldn't have been abused in there. Well, as I say, a Panorama reporter, his name is Robert Hall, was filmed in the cellars, and it clearly showed the height of him. And then more recently, Bob Hill, Jersey's own Bob Hill, was also filmed, and I think that film is still available on YouTube, which clearly shows that Warkup and Gradwell were not telling the complete truth when they said that the cellars, or voids as they call them, were only 2 or 3 feet high. And that's not the only thing, as you have alluded to, the exhibits that they showed. Well, I remember most of the controversy has been over the shackles. And I well remember those shackles being found, and I well remember refusing to confirm to the media, including Diane Simon, who asked me if I had found shackles. And I remember saying that I was refusing to confirm what we had found. But, Gradwell said these items were rusty metal. Of course they were rusty metal. They'd been in the ground for years. But it wasn't I who actually originally coined the term shackles. It was the builders who found them 5 years before, who told the media, including Diane Simon, that we would find shackles. And Diane Simon ran a story in which she called them shackles long before I ever mentioned the word shackles. So, there's so much misinformation and downright untruths that have been peddled as a result of that press conference. And none of the Jersey media have taken any steps whatsoever to try and nail down the truth of that. And I think that's to their discredit.
Here we go. It's a couple of allegations have been levelled against you. One being you had a personal vendetta against the Jersey establishments, and secondly, you were looking for a book deal. This is another allegation. I'm not sure if you're aware of it or not. And you created a frenzy at the Hotel Agarin in order to get yourself a nice little nest egg for your retirement to sell your book. How do you respond to that?
Well, let me deal with the first one first. Vendetta against the Jersey establishment. Why would I possibly have a vendetta against the Jersey establishment? I mean, I worked in a number of different jurisdictions. I worked in Northern Ireland. I worked in Scotland. I worked in London and various boroughs in London where I worked with governments, where I worked with councils of all political shades and views. Why on earth would I then choose Jersey to have a personal vendetta? My personal issue was not in the form of a vendetta. It was a personal issue of trying to get my job done on behalf of people that I was supposed to be working for, the people of Jersey, and that included the victims and survivors of the abuse inquiry. Also people who were subjected to the huge presence of at that time unlicensed firearms on the island, although most of them became licensed then, and also to do with police corruption and inappropriate behaviour. And I think it was round the issue of inappropriate conduct and corruption that my first battles with the Jersey establishment came. That was me trying to do the job that I was being paid for, not a personal vendetta. So, I had no personal vendetta against anybody. I had my back against the wall at times, trying to protect the illusion of an independent police service, which is what it had been in Jersey for so many years until Graham Power arrived. It was only when Graham Power arrived that the police service became truly independent, and some would have it go back actually to the days before that began. witnessing Markham's comments about bringing the police back under political control again, and that gives a clue as to where he sees the job of the police service. As for the book deal, well, I mean, the Jersey Evening Post went to extraordinary lengths. One of the reporters, whose name I won't mention, she'll know who she is. She comes from part of the British Isles, not too far from me. She rang a number of publishers and agents in the United Kingdom, and one in particular who then got back to me, who had approached me. I've been approached by a number of newspapers and agents and publishers to write a book, and my answer was the same to all of them as he repeated it to this journalist, that look, come and see me again whenever I've finished and retired. I'm not even thinking on it now. She rang up and told him that she had heard, presumably from me, that I had agreed, I think it was a six-figure sum for a book deal.
£1 million is what the rumour is.
Sorry?
£1 million book deal is the rumour.
I wish you could put me in touch with him. £1 million? Well, yeah, Pete, give me his phone number. They said, she said to him, it's been already agreed. And he says, no, he says, he freely admitted that he had contacted me, and he had. And he said, but Mr. Harper told me the same thing as he told everybody else. So, so that was nonsense. But here we are now, I think, 2.5 years down the line. And yes, I've toyed with it now and again, and I've discussed it with various friends who all say to me, you should do it. But frankly, I haven't got the time. There's too much that I'm doing that I'm enjoying at this moment to sit down. And there are others who are writing it who would do a far better job than me anyway. There's at least one journalist from America who's working very hard on the book that she's writing to try and give the true perspective. And there are many people who would do it much better than I. And as I say, I just haven't got the time at the moment.
Well, thanks for giving us that insight. Now, what I would like to ask you, with the interviews you've done with the accredited media and all of it, is there one question that you've never been asked and wish you were asked?
Well, I think that from a personal point of view, again going back to the Jersey media, I don't know where it came from, but the Jersey media put out a smear campaign, one of which was this nonsense which allegedly, and I don't know, allegedly was in the Wiltshire report, that we spent an awful lot of money on lavish meals and hotels, etc., etc. And my take on that, I've already answered that in print, but my take on that has always been that we had a hospitality budget which we used for the benefit of the inquiry and gained huge amounts of help and assistance. But the strange thing to me was that Wiltshire interviewed me 5 days, 5 complete days, and every single word of that was tape recorded. Now, those 5 days seem to have disappeared into the ether. A lot of the allegations being made by him, the Marcon and others, were answered in those 5 days of tape recorded interviews. But never once, not once in those 5 days, not once at any other time have I ever been asked about the expenditure, whether it's been on the inquiry or whether it's been on hospitality. And instead, these snide slurs have been thrown in our direction. And I can't fathom out how come Wiltshire would interview me for 5 solid days, not ask me anything at all about those matters.
So, hang on a minute, sorry, could I just cut? You have never been interviewed about your expenses? Never?
Never.
You're kidding?
No, I'm not. There are 5 days of tape recorded interviews with me, Wiltshire Police, and not once did the subject of expenses come up. I know other people have been interviewed. Scotland Yard officers were interviewed, and they not only demolished it, but also gave the Wiltshire constabulary officers menus and website details, and showed them the websites of the restaurant that we were being criticised for going, and showed them that, you know, this is not a lavish, this is a restaurant where you wouldn't be able to eat for that price in Jersey. And they were asked and made statements to that effect, and those statements never have surfaced. But no, not one single question was ever asked of me about my expenses.
So the Jersey media have never contacted you, because they have run some, you know, some very big stories on your alleged lavish lifestyle at the cost of the Jersey taxpayer. Well, none of those reporters have ever contacted you for your version of events?
No, never.
Staggering. Never. Absolutely staggering. That's the accredited media. The Jersey media, if you just mentioned them, what's your take on them? Are they, in your opinion, good professional journalists that report the news fairly and accurately, objectively, or do you, like myself, believe they're state-controlled?
Well, if you go down to individual presenters and journalists, there were a few that I met who I had a high regard for, who I felt whenever they were talking to me and interviewing me, were giving me a fair crack of the whip and were actually listening. But when you get to the editorial level and you get to the policy level, there is no doubt that they jumped on board with those who were trying to denigrate the abuse survivors and who were trying to discredit the whole investigation. Not to discredit the investigation because they had any dislike for the police or ourselves, but purely because that was what their political masters wanted. They wanted the abuse survivors discredited. They wanted the evidence and the stories that they were telling about the abuse that they suffered. They wanted that discredited. And so they went along with it, and they jumped into bed with some very strange bedfellows during their efforts to do that. I mean, for instance, you know, they were taking stories from and sharing stories with, as indeed were states members leaking emails to journalists who had made a career out of supporting convicted paedophiles and who had made a career out of discrediting abuse victims and survivors. For instance, by writing books and giving evidence to parliamentary select committees in support of people like the Leicestershire care rapist Frank Beck, and alleging that the North Wales care home abuse had never ever occurred, but it was all a conspiracy between so-called victims, as they put it, and the police to get compensation and to put innocent people away. So they did the victims no favours whatsoever. They launched a fairly vicious campaign against the abuse victims, and to get at the abuse survivors and victims, they of course came through Graham Power and myself by discrediting the investigation. But in reality, what they were doing was trying to persuade the public that the abuse that the victims had said they suffered was all a figment of their imagination.
Yeah, so we seem to be talking a lot about the investigation and everything now, rather than the abuse that took place. Do you think that was orchestrated by the media or by their masters to talk about the investigation rather than the abuse?
Well, I think that I don't think the media would have been capable of instigating that on their own. That came from their political masters, and I use political with a small p because for a start, I don't think for 1 minute that it was politicians who were driving the agenda, or elected politicians, should I say, that were driving the agenda. So I think that the media were just simply doing as they were told, and they were launching this campaign, which the only way they could do it, the only way they could discredit what the victims were alleging was to discredit the investigation that was supporting the evidence of the victims.
Well, that brings me on to the power structure in Jersey. Who do you think, who do you believe are the real power and influence in Jersey? Is it the politicians?
No, it's not the politicians, absolutely not. And this probably explains why there are so few. I mean, there are a lot of politicians in Jersey would feel out of the depth of the Parish Council in the United Kingdom. with a few notable exceptions, I have to say. But the politicians are not the power base. Politicians do as they're told, and they look at the real power in Jersey, and the people that cause the most fear in Jersey. You have to look at the upper echelons of the legal establishment, in particular in the law officers department. That is where the real power lay. The very fact of their position in Jersey society, and the fact that they've also got a foothold in the States, allowed them to wield the real power. And you could see their influence everywhere, and everything I tried to do in the abuse inquiry, no matter whether it was to do with politicians or policy, the law officers department were always in there as an obstruction. And no matter whether there were good people within that law officers department, they rose in every single problem that I had in Jersey. Going back to the abuse inquiry, there were lawyers working there who had views that the abuse was widespread, and that they were driving me behind the scenes and telling me what was going on. But when it came to the crunch, their jobs were being threatened. And in one instance, away from the abuse inquiry, where a young member who was working for the law officers department was a victim of a severe sexual harassment campaign, and she went to a lawyer working within the establishment who tried to support her, but was then threatened not only with her job but also with her husband's job. That was resolved whenever they looked around to find somewhere where they could send this female to work where she wouldn't be subjected to harassment. And they actually sent her to work for us, which seems to show some disparity with what Ian Lamarcon was saying about the bullying culture within the States. She came to work for us as a civilian and felt so comfortable and enjoyed it so much, she actually joined the police, and as far as I'm aware, she's still serving as a police officer. So, no matter where you looked, the influence of the law officers department was there, whether it was trying to put in lawyers in our office who were alleged to be specialist child abuse lawyers, but turned out in fact to be lawyers with no experience of child abuse, who just happened to work for a company that had very close links to the law office department, and whose office, whose chambers had won millions of pounds worth of contracts in Jersey. So everywhere you turn, the law officer's influence was there.
So you would say the most powerful influence in Jersey is the law officers? Without
a doubt. Without a shadow of a doubt. As I say, no matter what I was dealing with, no matter whether it was abuse inquiry, whether it was a firearms scandal, whether it was police corruption, the law officers department were there in every aspect of what we were trying to do.
I'd like to finish up by thanking you for giving us this interview, to taking the time out, for staying with all this. Could I finish this on what message would you, or have you got, for the abuse survivors and victims of the state-controlled child abuse?
From day one, whenever the victims and survivors, and I hope profoundly that they don't, that I know that some of them don't like the term victims, but I think you have to understand where I'm coming from, police officer background, and people who are victims of crime. We slip back into this habit of calling them victims. So I don't mean any slur on them by that, because from day one, since they started to tell us the horrific stories of what they had encountered, I've had nothing but the utmost respect for all of those victims. The vast majority of them went through terrible treatment. Their courage and their dignity stands in stark contrast to the, I think it was your colleague Rico who called them the foot-stomping lackeys whose disgraceful behaviour in the States whenever child abuse is mentioned, as if they're terribly bored with it all, where they stamp their feet. The courage and the dignity of the victims has stood out head and shoulders above all else. My one regret is that we didn't get them the justice that we hoped we would. I know they've said that we never promised them, but I was very hopeful that we would get the justice at the outset. What I didn't allow for was the lengths that some within the Jersey establishment would go to try and prevent that justice from being obtained. I'm sure that one day all of the facts will get a wider circulation in the public domain, because they are there at the moment through the efforts of yourselves and one or two other people. The facts are there for people to see if they know where to look for them. And I'm sure one day that the victims will get the justice they deserve. But, for me, the overriding impression that I'm left with is that the people who have suffered so much, the courage and the dignity that they have shown is in marked contrast to some others on the island.
Thanks for that, Mr. Harper, and hopefully we can do this sometime again.
Absolutely, no problem.
Thanks very much.